Hey guys, Zane here with another One Take review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Slipknot album, The End So Far. The End So Far is the latest studio album from, at this point, let's face it, metal legends and icons Slipknot. And if you are familiar with Slipknot, then that's kind of shocking in all honesty. They are truly one of the few metal bands to truly hit the mainstream in the most legitimate, full way that you possibly can, alongside a couple other artists like, say, Judas Priest and Pantera. Slipknot were also arguably, in retrospect, the absolute faces of the new metal slash alternative metal boom of the late 90s and early 2000s, perhaps the only mainstream act from that movement to really get a lot of critical acclaim, but that's not really hard to do considering it's not like Papa Roach were getting a ton of credit back in the day or anything like that. But my point still stands. Slipknot are one of the few acts from that movement, alongside, say, Korn, maybe, that really do hold up and manage to have a lot of impact in the current musical landscape. I mean, they have a number of classics under their belt, such as Iowa, as well as their self-titled album, a aesthetic that is still something that a lot of people try to repeatedly achieve over and over again, and despite the questionable originality of Slipknot's aesthetic, it's something that has definitely defined them as a band and really just set them as major forces in metal for the past almost 25 years, and that is something that is undeniable. However, The End So Far is much more than just another Slipknot record. It's actually a pretty major deal for Slipknot as a collective, as this is their last studio album with Roadrunner Records, at least for the time being, and probably forever if we're being totally honest. And if you don't know why that's a big deal, it's because Roadrunner has been with Slipknot since the very beginning, pretty much. I mean, they've seen this band go through all of their major hits that are now classics, all of their major albums that are now fan favorites, through their flops, their highs and their lows. They have been with Roadrunner Records, and seeing them finally leave the label is definitely a major change in the tide for Slipknot, and arguably even a major change for Roadrunner themselves as a label. There's also talks that this may very well just be the last Slipknot album in general, and if that is ultimately true, which it may very well be, then unfortunately the band go out with less of a bang and much more of a whimper, though frankly they've just been whimpering for quite some time now. The first thing to really take note of on The End So Far is just how thin all of it feels. It just kind of lacks any sort of heaviness or density. The riffs feel pathetic, and overall there's just not a lot of substance here in terms of fullness. It doesn't feel like a lot is being done here dynamically, and while it's not necessarily something that needs to be hugely focused upon, there does need to be a sense of atmosphere and directness towards the listener for any metal album, especially an album from a band as in-your-face as Slipknot, to really work, and it's just not here whatsoever, leaving The End So Far feeling a bit shallow and thin. Vocalist and primary frontman Corey Taylor especially does some poor work here, as he feels like a bad metalcore Fred Durst impersonator more than he does himself, and normally, generally speaking, he's actually a pretty intense vocalist. Even in Slipknot's weaker moments, he is still definitely there, he's engaging with the listener, and he's generally speaking a pretty standout member of a band that can definitely be not so standout in the grand scheme of metal, but unfortunately he just does not deliver his finest work here by any means. In fact, it almost sounds like he's phoning it in with a sort of fake, cringeworthy angst that really just drags down The End So Far even more than it already does just by existing. The End So Far also tries to be something very dramatic and heavy and almost theatrically destructive, and it makes sense. It's the end of an era for Slipknot, maybe just the end of Slipknot, period. That's a big deal. You gotta kind of go out with something massive for a band that have always been about being insane and crazy and over the top. It makes sense, but unfortunately it just feels thematically corny at best 9 times out of 10, with it just feeling kind of disingenuous compared to some of the other more emotive-reliant works that Slipknot has produced in the past. Just take a look at some of the more emotion-based tracks on an album like Iowa. Slipknot, whether you love them or hate them, are undeniable as genuine powerhouses of emotional metal when you actually want to just look at them from a more third-person kind of perspective, a slightly more objective perspective. They can genuinely do a lot with that particular sound and style of metal. It's just that, unfortunately, The End So Far feels like it's not even trying that hard to do so, and again, just falls flat and sort of belly flops into this pool of less than mediocrity because it's genuinely that frustrating and feels like that weak of an album to go out on. Perhaps worst of all about the end so far, though, is something that has frankly haunted Slipknot for about half, maybe three-quarters of their discography, and that's the fact that it's just genuinely laughable and cringeworthy a good portion of the time. A lot of this record really does pick up some of the worst qualities of nu metal and frat boy bro metal bands like Disturbed to create something that just tries to be so obnoxious and over the top and grand in nature that it doesn't really manage to do any of those things besides slightly grind your gears a little bit, act as something a bit grating to play in the background for a little bit under an hour. The end so far really is just completely insufferable most of the time, at least, as it tries to be something that it's not, which is a genuinely tough, violent, destructive album. It could have been a really powerful record to go out on for Slipknot, and unfortunately they tried to make something that was just much more energetic and ferocious than the band have been in quite some time. Again, it's not like Slipknot can't be ferocious or anything like that. I would be lying if I said that they weren't in the past. It's just that lately they haven't been, and them trying to do it again comes across like a bad cover band more than it does actual Slipknot. So overall, the end so far is honestly a pretty bad album to go out on. In fact, it's actually a genuinely terrible album with little to no redeeming qualities, as everything that has haunted Slipknot as a bad quality is present here, while everything that has haunted them as a good quality is pretty much lacking. I'm going to give this record 1 star out of 5. My one take on this record is that the end so far acts not only as potentially Slipknot's worst album, but also a depressing ending to a metal band that arguably never quite reached their full potential. So again, 1 star out of 5, and with that being said, that is the end of this review, and I will see you guys in the next one.